It's first wave.
If you ever say vintage Star Wars and you're talking about the 90s, you're fired.
The hell? Hey, so I thought you said that this is from 1997 Jurassic Park. This isn't vintage?
Yes, that is vintage.
First of its thing. It's first generation.
That's just dumb.
Yeah. It's first wave.
That's just stupid.
It's first wave.
If you ever say vintage Star Wars and you're talking about the 90s, you're fired.
I wouldn't say that. If I said vintage,
you're fired.
If I said,
I don't know. That's not up for debate. You're fired. You don't work here anymore.
It's 90s vintage.
No,
90s vintage.
It's not. You do not work here anymore. If somebody ever comes in and says, "Hey, I'm looking for vintage Star Wars," and you go, "Are you talking about 70s vintage or 90s vintage?"
That's the appropriate.
No, you're done. You don't work here. I don't want you here.
How many energy drinks have you had?
Not enough.
Too many. Be grouchy.
I'm not being a grouch. That's honesty. Don't talk about vintage Star Wars and mention the 90s. You're fired. You don't work here. You're done.
I just don't get your point though. Like,
I don't care. I do not care about the official term of vintage. I don't. It does not matter to me. Vintage in this world is all relative to what property you are talking about. What is a vintage transformer? G1, 84 to 92.
G2 is considered vintage.
G2 is vintage.
G2 is not vintage.
G2's vintage.
G2 is not.
Machine Wars is vintage.
It's not vintage.
And Beast Wars.
Beast Wars is vintage.
It's not vintage.
Beast Wars is vintage.
I will die on this hill. It is not vintage.
Yes, it is.
Everyone considers it vintage. What the fuck?
No. Not everybody considers that vintage.
Comment. The toy company themselves considers it vintage.
If you agree with these people, you're wrong. I don't care.
vintage. This. Vintage. Year 2000.
That?
For kids my age, this is vintage.
Kids your age?
For people my age, the young generation, the better generation.
That's a relative term. In a actual debate, in the court of law, if you present a question like you just did, the judge is going to rule that non-relevant. Because you are setting them up to answer a specific way. Transformers. What is Vintage He-Man? You let them answer it. You cannot say, okay, but by technicality, like, no,
True.
that is persuading somebody to answer a specific way.
So if I were to hit somebody with a question, is 90s property vintage? And they said yes. Wouldn't that mean everything 90s would be considered vintage if their answer to that is that 90s is vintage?
Bringing that up is leading. No, that's not how you ask the question. You're still trying to get them to answer your specific, way. You want them to answer you in the way that you want to hear it. You have to be the most vague, the most basic as possible. That's how you get the most honest, straight answer of what people think.
I think asking if 90s is vintage is a pretty vague question. I asked if vintage Redline Hot Wheel is considered the only vintage Hot Wheels. And you were saying that, in your opinion, that everything up into 80-something was considered vintage.
Well, with Hot Wheels, you have different generations of vintage. Because you have, and I think that probably goes with everything. In the antique world or the vintage world, 25 years or older is vintage, up to 75 and older would be antique. Well, it's not 75, it's 100. 100 years old designates an antique, all right, in the collector world, all right? So 25 years to 100 years would be vintage, and then 100 years older would be antique. In the toy world, I think that it is a little bit different, because maybe you don't have a property that came out until 95. Okay. Well, between 95 and 99, you know, we would consider that vintage for that particular property, which makes perfect sense. But let's just talk about GI Joes, and then we'll hit on Hot Wheels.
Me,
All right,
vintage,
but
vintage 12-inch GI Joe would be from 64 to 76.
right,
That is your vintage 12-inch GI Joe.
That's
as soon
exactly
as it picks up in the mid 90s, that is, from there on, every 12-inch GI Joe that's produced, not vintage.
well,
What about toys back from when he was in the nom?
Dang.
Shout out to Grayson.
anyway, so Chance, yeah, but you're going to have people that consider those 90s Joes, 90, 96, whatever it was, the resurgence of them, 96 through 99 is going to be a vintage Joe to them.
That was my argument, is that kids my age are going to say, like, Power of the Force Star Wars is vintage because it's from before we were born. Like, or same with the
And
G.I.
it's a
Joe.
legitimate argument. I think in the toy circles, I see where Chance is coming
I
from.
think it's laughable.
I feel like me.
I
It was
don't think that
different.
has anything to do with a viewpoint. I think that has everything to do with being knowledgeable.
Dang.
Like, do I agree that 70s vintage, 70s and even 80s Star Wars is vintage? Yes. But for a younger kid my age, if it's from the 90s, it's automatically vintage.
I think
You're
that
not down
I-
either one of those.
I
So-
think all that means is that you need to do a little bit of research.
20
Personally.
So look, the way that me and him had a conversation about this morning, okay? The way that this seems to work to me now is based upon the era that it's from. So like G1, you know, if it's in Japan, it ends in 92. So that's everything 92 in Japan is considered vintage. Whereas like the modern era, there is no vintage toy other than the one from 2000 called Robots in Disguise. Because that's where the modern era starts.
So this is something that's good to bring up. Vintage Transformers is 84 to 92. Okay, that's the cutoff. If you want to technically throw in 93 because that's when it ended in Europe, that's fine. G2 picks up to Matt and I. That is not considered vintage. Anything G2 and on is not considered a vintage Transformer. However, you have specific lines that have been repeated in the Transformer toy line. Beast Wars is a good example, okay? The original Beast Wars toys are vintage Beast Wars. They're not vintage Transformers.
It's different. Power Rangers, right? So they change every year. It's still under the same brand, but it's a whole new cast of people. It's a whole different story. How is that not going to continue to be vintage in 2003?
Because Power Rangers can be dissected down to makes, who own the franchise, the property, all that kind of stuff. You said that Power Rangers started. I don't know a lot about Power Rangers. I'm just going to throw this out there. It's not my favorite property. So, to me, vintage Power Rangers would be 93 to what you said was the end of the original Saban era, which was 2002, right? So anything from 93 to 2002 to me would be vintage Power Rangers. Who picked it up in 03?
Disney.
Okay, so everything from 03, Disney, onward, to me would not be a vintage Power Ranger. So that's part of the Saban era, but it's not part of the vintage Saban
I
era.
understand that.
That is modern.
Because that's 2011. That's like Next Mutation Turtles. That is that was 96, 97. Next Mutation. Or no, it's like 97, 98.
Okay, what year is it?
Like
What year is it right now?
2024.
Okay, so when are vintage Power Rangers?
90s. Just because
90s?
I'd
Like
say-
90s in its entirety.
Well, if you do it by years, the cutoff is going to be 99.
It's going to be 98.
Yeah.
So anything from 93 to 98 is what you would consider to be vintage Power Rangers.
I guess. I mean, if somebody wanted to say,
But they ran the original. They ran the original Power Ranger line by Saban until 2002, right?
It's not it was just the company
Or
that owned
Saban
it.
or whatever.
Saban, he owned the company up until 2002.
Given Power Rangers in, let's just say, 20 years. Okay, 20 years, 21 years, whatever. It'll be 2045, right? In 2045, are you saying that vintage Power Rangers is going to be everything from 93 all the way up to, what's the up to 2025 or 2020? Like,
That
you
would-
think vintage
that-
Power Rangers
yes,
is going
that
to be
would-
everything
because
from
of the year.
93 to 2020?
Because 25 years from now,
It's going to be. There will be vintage.
it'll be considered vintage because all of the kids who grew up during that
By
era-
technicality,
by
sure.
yes. Now, will
By intelligent thought, no.
what was the series 25 years ago was not vintage?
So you're saying that original and vintage are not synonymous?
like I can understand where you're coming from, where it's like for Star Wars, like 70s and 80s Star Wars is the original vintage Star Wars. That's not to say that 90s is not vintage because 25 years later, it's 25 years.
So you're saying it's vintage, it's just not original?
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That's
Like
probably a pretty good way of putting it.
it's the original
Vintage
version.
original and then vintage.
vintage original, and
New
then
vintage.
new vintage.
I guarantee you that nobody in here that's older than the age of like 22 is going to walk in here and say vintage Star Wars and talking about 90s.
So that argument, Hot Wheels. Okay. There are several different eras of vintage Hot Wheels. You have 68 through 77 is the red line era of Hot Wheels. Okay. That is considered vintage red line Hot Wheels. Then you have 77 through 85, which would be considered vintage Blackwall era Hot Wheels. Then you have 85 through 91, which would be considered another era of cars because the cars all changed. They all changed by the manufacturer. They all changed up to 91. And then you have an era, which is the not so good era for Hot Wheels. Well, you can have the same with, I know you're going to hate it, Star Wars, or the same with Transformers, or the same with G.I. Joe. All right, we consider 80s 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe vintage. All right.
82 to 94, the era of G.I.
Of
Joes
3
are
3/4
vintage
right.
3 3/4.
Right. And then you have vintage 12 inch G.I. Joe. 64
to
through
76.
76. Okay. Right. But people that aren't in the collecting circles that give us a call, hey, I have some of my son's vintage G.I. Joe. Or I have some of my son's vintage Star Wars. First thing I ask him, how old is he? With all of this debate that we've had for the last, there's going to be a lot of people that object to every single one of our views, just like I object to some of your views. You and I see eye to eye, pretty much, but he objects
On the poor man's side of the
on
argument. Yes.
the non-intellectual side of things. Yeah, please feel free to let us know and comment.
Let's know in the comments.
You're 27,
What the
so
hell do you know about Transformers?
What the hell you mean? I'm your dude. But look, all right.
Oh, his plight is sincere.
I don't consider Beast
The man behind the
Machines-
camera is Second Chance Toys Transformers aficionado.
I guess not
He is-
anymore. Chance is gonna have to take over. Okay, so here's my thing, right? This is a hypothetical that I presented to my dad and that I presented to Kelly. Okay. Let's say somebody walks in with a bunch of Star Wars stuff, 90s Star Wars stuff. All right. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna walk back here and I'm gonna go, hey Dad, Kelly, you wanna come look at some really cool vintage Star Wars up front? Okay. They're gonna walk up front. They're immediately gonna see it and they're gonna go, They're gonna hang their head, and that's when I know I got them.